Welcome to Terrifying Tales, the channel dedicated to bringing you original horror stories. Please support the channel by hitting the like button or leaving a comment, and please consider subscribing to the channel by hitting the subscribe button on the bottom right hand corner of the screen. Sunrise. Hank Murdoch pulled his truck into the gravel beside the Silver Bullet diner. The Bullet sat on a lonely stretch of highway 110 miles out of Phoenix. Too small a place to warrant a name, the only other building standing on the stretch was the cheap motel opposite named the Palms. The gravel crunched beneath Hank's boots as he climbed down from the cab. Truth was, the Bullet was known to have the worst food and coffee inside the state lines. But at 5:20 in the morning, on his regular run, Hank didn't have many options to choose from. Given the choice between no coffee and breakfast or the Bullet, Hank often found himself stopping there. The dusty horizon shimmered with the hint of dawn. Hank pulled his cap from his head and mopped the sweat resting on his brow with his sleeve. Going to be hotter than a metal slide at midday when that sun comes up. The bell above the door jingled as Hank trudged through the front door of the Bullet. Billy Martin was working the grill in the kitchen behind the counter. The old grease-covered apron sat awkwardly around him, fighting to keep his gut in. The thought passed through Hank's mind that the apron would suddenly give up and tear down the middle from the stress. Hank suppressed a smile at the thought. "How goes it, Hank?" Billy said. Hank gave a friendly nod and headed toward his usual booth. He gave thought to choosing somewhere different to sit. A group of teenage girls dressed to the nines were sitting at the booth directly behind his, and they were a little too loud for Hank's liking. Patty decided for him. She sat the cup down at the booth and filled it with coffee. "Usual, Hanky?" "Thanks, Patty," he said. Patty smiled and headed toward the kitchen. Hank liked Patty. She was pretty, but her eyes were always tired. He supposed it resulted from working through the night at the Bullet. In fact, Hank couldn't remember a time it wasn't Patty who took his order. More than once, he'd wanted to ask her out for dinner, but found he couldn't. Hank was better looking than he realised, but looks that he'd grown into over the years. Girls had never been interested in him growing up, and Hank never presumed to think anything had changed in that regard. Hank bristled as soon as he sat. "Did you see her shoes?" one girl said. Another sniggered. "And the makeup. Poor woman must be blind to come to work looking like the sad clown." One girl found it hilarious enough to choke momentarily on her food. "She's too tragic to even feature in a dollar store catalogue." Hank made the silent decision to turn on them if they added another word against Patty, but they quieted for the moment. Hank's eyes drifted to the booth window and the shimmering horizon. These girls wouldn't know a day's work if it bit them on the arse. A fact lost on them was Patty's raggedy-looking tennis shoes were purely for comfort. Since Patty was on her feet all day, she needed comfortable shoes. Poor Patty wouldn't be able to walk for a week if she pulled a 12-hour waitressing shift in a pair of designer heels. As far as her looks were concerned, Hank thought their criticism was unwarranted. Hank took little stock in looks, but even so, he liked the way Patty looked, especially her smile. A bead of sweat dropped from Hank's face to the faded white table of the booth. He used his sleeve to mop it up. "You'd think they'd have air conditioner in here," one girl muttered, "even in a dump like this." "These hicks don't realise that smell is them," another replied. Movement drew Hank's eyes to the window. Guests at the motel were chancing their health by getting in the outdoor pool out front. Hank shuddered at the thought. He'd wandered over there on more than one occasion to inspect that swimming pool. The top of the water looked more like the sediment setting on top of a swamp than a blue oasis. Hank couldn't blame them today, though. The horizon was a painter's palette of orange and navy blue. The sun wasn't up yet, and the heat was almost unbearable. While he wouldn't do it himself, he could understand the motel guests' desire to cool off. Hank watched the guests in the pool as the first rays climbed over the horizon. He let out a sigh as the heat seemed to increase immediately. Paddy hunched over the counter like a marathon runner at the finish line, and Billy was struggling over the grill, his face beet red. Hank headed for the bathroom just for respite. It was cooler in the John, but not by much. Even out of the sunlight, the room was heating like an oven. He filled the basin and splashed the water over his face. It did nothing. The cold tap gave only hot water. Damn good thing that truck has AC, he thought. Hank glimpsed himself in the mirror. It wasn't just his forehead. Large semicircles of sweat hung beneath his armpits, and stains were appearing on his chest and stomach. The air was hot and sticky, and breathing was becoming a chore. A drowning feeling of claustrophobia filled him. Hank's hands pushed through the bathroom door with more aggression than he meant. Faint screams drifted from the Palms Motel across the highway. Steam was rising from the water. Even from this far away, Hank could see it. His eyes grew wide. Flesh was dropping from the people staggering out of the water in clumps of gooey mess. The girls in the booth sat in frozen fear, their mouths agape at the scene. Hank had the momentary thought that the girls apparently could keep their mouths shut, then scolded himself for it. There was another scream, much closer. It was Paddy. Hank moved away from the bathroom door, instantly hit by the smell that made him cover his mouth. It was a sick burning smell, partly sweet, but indescribably gut-churning. Billy was lying face first on the grill. Hank hurried through the kitchen door and helped Paddy drag Hank away. Bile rose in Hank's throat as he looked at the bubbling, torn skin of Billy's face. The well-worn apron fused to his skin in a macabre mesh of fabric and burnt flesh. Hank didn't need to check for a pulse. The man was dead. Hank lifted a sobbing Paddy away from Billy's body. A sucking sound carried from the booths. The girls were clutching their throats. Rays from the sun were crawling through the bullets' front windows. Hank's pulse pounded in his skull. The girls clawed and scrambled over each other onto the restaurant floor. The restaurant air was growing too hot to breathe. Their skin bubbled with sores and split as the rays drifted over them like lava crawling from the mouth of a volcano. "We've got to help them," Paddy said and pushed through the kitchen door. "Wait, Paddy!" Hank grabbed for the woman, taking a fistful of sleeve fabric. Paddy fell back, her legs in the restaurant, the rest in the kitchen. A blood-curdling scream erupted from her throat as the sun's rays drifted over her feet and legs. Hank dragged her through the door. Paddy's legs were bubbling in blisters from the heat. He thought it a mercy Paddy couldn't see what he could. The girls were convulsing on the restaurant floor, blood and pus spewing from their bodies, hair falling out in clumps. Blisters burst all over their bodies, shooting eruptions of pus into the air. It was the pus that did it. The smell that filled Hank's throat like fog. He turned his head and threw up in the middle of the kitchen. Hank's eyes darted around and settled on the walk-in freezer. He dragged a sobbing Paddy across the kitchen floor to the big silver door. The rays of the sun continued to creep. They rolled over the open kitchen counter and across the tiles. Billy's lifeless body sizzled as the rays covered it like a rolling tide and continued toward Paddy and Hank. He threw the freezer door open and dragged Paddy inside. He sucked in a deep breath. The freezer air free of the heat. Hank found some frozen bags of fries and placed them on Paddy's legs. She screamed in pain. Her tear-streaked eyes fell on Hank. "What's happening?" Hank could only shake his head. A drop of sweat fell from Hank's forehead onto the freezer floor. Steady drips of water soon joined it from the freezer shelves as everything defrosted. Hank dropped to the floor and sat beside Paddy. She rested her crying face on Hank's shoulder. From the open freezer door, Hank could see the entire kitchen bathed in sunlight. A metal whisk sitting on the bench liquefied. The steady silver drip ran from the bench, creating a silver puddle on the white tiles. Paddy whimpered. She kept her head buried in Hank's shoulder. He felt her trembling and put his arm around her. The air was still comfortable inside the freezer. It was heating up, but not life-threatening. Maybe they could wait the sun out here for the day. He would need to keep Paddy comfortable and keep her from going into shock, but maybe they stood a chance. A terrible thump and whine filled the bullet, followed by a thunderous bang. Hank's stomach dropped. Paddy's terrified eyes rose from Hank's shoulder. They both knew what that sound meant. The freezer motor had just died. If you like what you heard, please like and share the video, and please subscribe to the channel. Remember, the dark plays tricks with our mind. Sometimes it isn't a trick. Sometimes there really is something there.